Starting June the 21st, the United States government is set to ban imports of goods coming from China's Xinjiang. Xinjiang produces 20% of world's cotton and accounts for half of global production of the raw material for semiconductors. This ban is likely to plunge global supply chains into further chaos. Despite all the high-minded rhetoric on human rights, the law enabling this ban actually came a long way from a piece of poorly produced fiction. So, how did a lie become law? First, let's take a look at the cause for this legislation. The so-called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was prompted by the claim that there was forced labor in Xinjiang. It was so bold to claim that the number of the people in Xinjiang subject to arbitrary detention and forced labor was estimated to be 1.8 million. But where did this number come from? A man named ZANZ played a key role. ZANZ is a so-called researcher from Germany. He has close ties to ultra-rightist groups. It has only been to Xinjiang once as a tourist, but it didn't seem to hurt his reputation as a Xinjiang expert on Western media. In 2018, ZANZ was among the first to claim that the total number of detainees in Xinjiang might reach over 1 million. The number 1 million soon paraded into the legislative process of the U.S. Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act that started in early 2019. And after ZANZ casually upped the number to 1.8 million in his 2019 report, the new figure almost immediately found its way into the bill that later shaped to be the so-called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. But how did ZANZ come up with those numbers? The number 1 million first surfaced in ZANZ's report in 2018. Curiously, ZANZ's groundbreaking finding was attributed to a story in Japanese. And this story in turn cited the figure 890,000, which was cobbled together by a Xinjiang separatist outlet named Istiklal TV. That is to say, a fishy third-hand account was packaged into ZANZ's study to prove the validity of mass detention. But this shady finding soon hogged the news headlines. And ZANZ's claim even prompted Mike Pompeo to play fast and loose with a genocidal accusation on China. Since the U.S. Xinjiang embargo is allegedly designed to prevent forced labor, then how did ZANZ prove the existence of forced labor in Xinjiang in the first place? ZANZ made a major discovery in an online Chinese essay. The essay claims that when it comes to the Xinjiang cross-region labor transfer, there are two sets of approach known respectively as to inform and guide those in rural area and voluntary participation. ZANZ therefore assumed the first approach was supposed to be the opposite of voluntary, hence mandatory. In this way, ZANZ successfully misrepresented what in Chinese context means motivating people to get employed as forcing labor to displace. Another key evidence for forced labor ZANZ produced was a claim that the Uyghur ethnic workers are subject to the custody of the government minders and dedicated security personnel. However, if we trace down the source ZANZ quoted, there was no mention of security personnel in the original Chinese text. And the government employees were only tasked to provide service to Uyghur ethnic workers. This is how ZANZ profited from discrepancies during Chinese to English translation and painted them as evidence of human rights violation. Following the footnotes of these twisted interpretations, we also discovered who on earth helped ZANZ pull the trick of loss in translation. ASPI, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is famous for fomenting anti-China hysteria. Last year, 1/10 of ASPI's revenue were earmarked by the U.S. Department of Defense for the so-called Xinjiang human rights studies. Even before ZANZ was hailed by Western media as the go-to person on anything Xinjiang, ZANZ had already co-authored his early pieces on Xinjiang with an ASPI researcher named James Leibold, another self-vaunted China expert. Those publications were released mainly by the Jamestown Foundation, an ultra-conservative think tank founded by a former CIA chief. In other words, ZANZ fabricated a web of lies about Xinjiang with the help of the US-funded academics and the US-funded platforms. Still, ZANZ's Xinjiang study could turn out totally unconvincing once carefully examined, then how come it later shaped the Western public perception of Xinjiang and went so far as to affect the US legislation? This is when Radio Free Asia, or RFA, came into the picture. For a long time, this US government-funded propaganda organ has been on the vanguard that publicizes ZANZ's latest findings on Xinjiang. A simple internal search of the name Adrian ZANZ on RFA website would even yield a couple dozens more results than that of Antony Blinken, the incumbent US Secretary of State. Through such repetitious publication, RFA allows forced labor theory and other fringe notions about Xinjiang to be picked up by the mainstream. RFA has kept insisting its independence as a media outlet, but the U.S. Strategic Competition Act of 2021 has clearly outlined a plan to prop up its China-related language services by the way of over $20 million in funding. The act cited RFA's Xinjiang coverage as a justification for that decision. RFA's connections in the United States politics goes even further. Rushan Abbas, for example, was the first correspondent in RFA's Uyghur service. In 2017, she founded Campaign for Uyghurs, a Xinjiang separatist group based in Washington. This organization was funded by U.S. National Endowment for Democracy. In 2020, Abbas even attended Donald Trump's State of the Union address at the invitation of Senator Marco Rubio, who happens to be a major sponsor of the so-called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. RFA helped ZANZ rise into global stardom, but it was the mainstream Western media that enabled him to wreak havoc. In particular, BBC reached out to ZANZ for more findings on Xinjiang, and ZANZ proudly boasted a 17,000-word report with 163 footnotes. But apparently, those words and footnotes were not duly verified by the media. Instead, ZANZ based its claims on Xinjiang were presented to a wider audience under lyric headlines, again, again, and again. Finally, the time was ripe. ZANZ was asked to testify before U.S. Congress. His so-called study was heavily quoted by the U.S. government in its attempt to smear China on Xinjiang issue. ZANZ even rushed the United States to enact the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in his allegedly academic report. The act was passed last December, and is set to take effect on June the 21st this year. Adrian ZANZ's evil cause materialized. He successfully turned a lie into law. But it didn't put it off without help. U.S. government, Xinjiang separatist groups, ultra-rightist think tanks, and the Western media, which claimed themselves to be independent and objective. Through concerted efforts, a matrix of disinformation was formed. Invisible to many, yet ubiquitous in its existence. The act takes effect, mocking justice under the fig leaf of protecting human rights. And the matrix that sanctifies lies is still there. It makes one wonder, what lie will be concocted next?